Welcome to the Deceived Mike channel. Imagine finding out that the person you loved more than anything in the world doesn't feel the same way anymore. Then, watching your child turn their back on you, too. This is the story of how betrayal shattered everything I thought I knew about love, family, and the price of holding on to the truth. I'm Daniel, and I've been married to my wife, Emily, for 18 years now. Together, we have a daughter named Sarah. She's 17, just about to start navigating the world in her own way. For work, I'm a mechanical engineer at the local car factory. Most of my days are spent making sure the equipment runs like clockwork and the production line doesn't hit any snags. So, it was just another typical warm April afternoon when I felt my phone vibrating in my pocket. My hands were covered in grease, but I wiped them off on a rag and checked the screen. It was Brian, my neighbor. That immediately raised an eyebrow. Brian almost never called me during the day, especially not while I was at work. Curious and a bit concerned, I swiped to answer. His voice came through the line, sharp and urgent, almost on the edge of panic. "Daniel, you need to get home. Right now." My stomach sank like a rock. "What's going on?" I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. "There's a moving truck parked in front of your place. A couple of guys are hauling furniture into it," he said quickly. I froze. "What? Who the hell are they?" "No idea," Brian said, his voice low and serious. "But they're loading up a ton of stuff. And your wife? She's there too. Thought you ought to know." "Emily," my heart started pounding in my chest. "You sure about that?" "Positive. You need to get here fast." I didn't even think twice. Slipped the phone back in my pocket and made a beeline across the factory floor, my boots echoing loud thuds on the concrete. My mind was spinning. Was someone robbing my house in broad daylight? Or was this something even worse? I reached my boss's office, rapped once on the door, then barged in. "Sir, I've got to leave. Right now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked up from a stack of paperwork. Gruff guy, but fair. "What's going on?" "My neighbor just called. There's a moving van at my place. They're taking my stuff. Might be a burglary." His eyes went wide. "Go. Don't waste time." I didn't wait for him to say it again. Spun around and bolted for the parking lot, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. Fumbling with my keys, I threw open the car door, jumped inside, and fired up the engine. Tires screeched as I tore out of there like a bat out of hell, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I didn't know what the hell I was about to walk into, but I had a gut feeling this wasn't just a break-in. And the fact that Emily was there, that threw everything into chaos. I floored it, flying through the streets toward home, my thoughts a tangled mess. When I hit the driveway, I slammed on the brakes, tires squealing in protest. I threw the door open and stormed toward the scene, adrenaline surging through me. Right there in front of my house was this guy, tall, lanky, with a smug, arrogant posture, barking orders to two other dudes who were busy shoving my furniture into the back of the moving truck. "Hey, what's going on here?" I called out, approaching quickly. He barely gave me the time of day, muttering, "Stay out of this," he muttered. That was it. That was the match to the powder keg. Before I realized it, we were in a physical struggle, and he fell back. He hit the ground with a grunt, but I wasn't about to stop. I moved toward him, trying to stop him, my emotions running high. "You think you can just take my stuff?" I demanded. In the middle of the day, another punch. He groaned and tried to cover up, but I wasn't letting him off easy. I managed to grab my phone with one hand, punched in 911, and forced myself to speak through heavy breaths. "There's a man here stealing from my house." I managed to hold him down, I said, still holding my fist midair, waiting for the authorities to arrive. The dispatcher stayed calm and steady. "Sir, step inside and lock your door. Officers are on the way." I let out a dry, bitter laugh. "I've got the situation under control." Then, out of nowhere, a shrill voice cut through the air. "Daniel, what are you doing?" I looked up, startled, and saw Emily sprinting toward us, her face twisted in disbelief. She dropped to the ground beside the guy, her hands shaking as she touched his face, checking on him. "Why did you hit him?" she yelled at me, eyes blazing with anger. I stared, trying to process what I was seeing. "You know him?" She snapped her head up, fury burning in her eyes. "Yes, he's my boyfriend." It felt like the world stopped. The breath got knocked out of me. "What That was all I could say before I stepped forward, and he doubled over in pain, collapsing to the ground. "You're my wife," I spat, my voice trembling with fury. "And you're sleeping with someone else?" I stepped toward him again, anger clouding my thoughts. Emily cried out, "Daniel, stop. Please stop." But I wasn't done. I spun toward the moving truck, my head spinning. What the hell is this truck even doing here? I shouted. The guy just groaned, still clutching himself. His silence pissed me off even more, so I stepped forward once more, my emotions boiling over, unable to hold back how I truly felt. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed the two movers standing off to the side near their truck, arms crossed, leaning casually, with smirks on their faces like they were watching the latest episode of their favorite soap opera. Hell, I couldn't blame them. If I weren't the one caught up in this mess, I probably would have found it entertaining too. Then came the sirens, sharp and piercing, slicing through the air. Within seconds, two police cruisers rolled up to the curb, lights flashing, tires crunching over gravel. The officers climbed out, their hands resting casually on their holsters, eyes scanning the scene in front of them. There I stood, breathing heavy, towering over the beaten guy on the ground. Emily was still crouched beside him, fussing over his bruised face like he was some kind of fragile treasure. And the movers? Still hanging back, soaking in the drama like they had front-row seats at a fight. One of the officers, a tall guy with a broad chest and a face that didn't mess around, made a beeline for me. He placed a solid hand on my chest, creating a little distance between me and the guy I just dropped. "Step back, sir," he said firmly. My fists were still clenched tight, knuckles aching, but I did as told, taking a step back, lungs still working overtime. "I'm the one who called this in," I said, frustration thick in my voice. The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting that. "Is that right?" "Yeah," I snapped. "My neighbor called me, said some guys were loading up my furniture. I rushed home and found this guy." I pointed to the man on the ground, groaning, still holding his side, avoiding my eyes. The officer turned toward Emily, who hadn't moved an inch, her hand still gently cupping the guy's face. Her eyes were red, from crying, maybe anger, and for a second I thought I saw a trace of guilt. "Ma'am, can you tell me what's happening here?" the officer asked. Emily looked up, wiped at her eyes, and took a breath before speaking. Her voice trembled, but her words came out steady. "This man is Kevin Morgan," she said, her eyes locked on the officer. "He's my boyfriend." I felt my stomach twist into knots, even though I'd already heard it once. But hearing it again, out loud, from her lips, so flat, so emotionless, it hit me like a punch I didn't see coming. She stood up, squared her shoulders, and added, "I'm leaving Daniel, and I'm taking half the furniture with me." My brain felt like it short-circuited. 18 years, nearly 2 decades of building a life together, reduced to this? A moving truck, and this smug guy lying injured on my driveway. The officer glanced back at me. I must have looked completely stunned. That's exactly how I felt, like everything had hit me at once. He cleared his throat, bringing us back to reality. "Mrs. Parker," he began, keeping his tone calm but authoritative, "did you let your husband know you were planning to leave?" Emily hesitated, just for a moment, then lifted her chin like she was ready for a fight. "No." The officer sighed, rubbing his forehead, clearly familiar with situations like this. "Ma'am, let me explain something to you." He motioned toward the truck, then looked her square in the eye. "To take any of this furniture, you need to go through the proper legal process. That means filing for divorce. Once a judge splits up the property, both of you will need to sign off on who gets what." I saw her face pale slightly. She hadn't expected that. "Ma'am, this situation needs to be handled legally," the officer said calmly. "Your husband could involve the authorities if proper steps aren't followed." Emily's mouth dropped open, her eyes wide with shock. She quickly spun around to the movers. "Put it all back," she barked, her voice tense. The two guys, clearly still amused, just shrugged and started hauling the furniture back inside like it was no big deal. The officer folded his arms and shot her a look that said he was done playing games. "You can take your clothes, nothing more. I'll stick around to make sure everything goes smoothly." Emily turned toward him, eyes blazing with fury. I think he should leave, she said sharply, her frustration clear. I didn't miss a beat. This house belongs to my mother. You have zero claim on it. Her voice went up an octave. No, you need to leave. I deserve to live here. That did it. The officer's patience snapped. He narrowed his eyes, and his voice got real cold. Ma'am, considering what just happened, it wouldn't be appropriate to ask him to leave his own home, the officer said firmly. He scoffed. Let's see if he wants to press charges. He turned to me, eyebrows raised, waiting for my answer. Before I could get a word out, Emily threw her arms in the air and stormed toward the house. Fine. I'll grab my stuff, she spat, disappearing inside. I stood there, still trying to make sense of what the hell had just happened. 18 years. A marriage, a daughter, a home. And now, Emily, the woman I thought I knew, had been sneaking around behind my back with some lowlife and was ready to clean me out like I didn't matter. A few minutes later, she reappeared, dragging 2 oversized suitcases toward the door. As she moved, I raised a hand and looked at the officer. Hold up, I said. I want those bags checked. Emily froze in her tracks, then turned slowly to face me, her eyes wide with disbelief. Daniel, really? You're going to humiliate me like this? She hissed. Don't you trust me? That did it. Before I could even reply, the movers exchanged glances, clearly amused by the situation. Even the officers seemed slightly surprised by the turn of events. One of them actually smirked, the other shaking his head like he'd heard it all before, but still couldn't believe this circus. The officer in charge let out a sigh, clearly done with the drama. Open the bags, ma'am, he said, his tone firm now. Your husband has every right to check. Emily glared at me like I'd personally ruined her day. Imagine that. But she unzipped the first suitcase anyway and stepped back, arms crossed, seething. I crouched down and started digging through it. Clothes, mostly. Folded too neatly, like she'd been planning this for a while. Among the neatly folded clothes, I noticed some of my personal items, my laptop and charger, which caught me off guard. I pulled them out, held them up. She let out a tiny, almost defeated sigh. I need those, she said. I laughed, short, cold, completely humorless. You have someone else to rely on now, I said quietly, not looking away. And just like that, she was gone. Packed her bags, took her true love, and walked down my life like 18 years meant nothing. Kevin was clearly in discomfort, and while I didn't feel sorry for him, I knew things had gone too far. But it didn't last. The house was dead silent now, eerie, almost hollow, and the reality started to creep in. Everything had changed. Then the front door creaked open. Sarah walked in, backpack slung over one shoulder, eyebrows furrowed as she took in the chaos. Half-moved furniture, open suitcases, footprint from the movers stamped all over the floor. She dropped her bag and looked around, confused. Dad, what the hell happened here? I rubbed my temples, feeling the tension coil tighter. Come sit down, I said, patting the couch beside me. She sat, eyes locked on mine, waiting. I took a long breath. Your mother's decided to leave, I said, keeping my voice even. She's gone, with her new lover. Sarah blinked once, then shrugged like it was no big deal. Oh, you mean Kevin? I stared at her, surprised, realizing how much she already knew. Wait, you knew about him? She gave me a look like I was the one being slow. Yeah, she said, like it was obvious. Mom told me about him. He's her first love, her true love. Those words hit hard, like a shock I never expected. I stood up, walked over to the counter, and poured myself a drink, my hand steady despite the storm in my chest. I turned back, drink in hand, and sat down again. So, I said, trying to keep my voice calm, tell me more about this Kevin. Sarah leaned back, arms crossed like we were just having a casual chat. Mom talked about him all the time. He was her first love, said she never stopped loving him. She shrugged. She married you because you were a good choice. A decent man. I let out a dry laugh, shaking my head. A good choice. That's all I was. Not someone she loved. Just the safe bet. I looked at her, really looked at her. So, tell me, Sarah, do you think your mother did the right thing? Leaving me for Kevin. She didn't even blink. Oh yeah, she said, like it was the most obvious answer in the world. You were just an arrangement. They were meant to be together. I nodded slowly, swirling the drink in my glass. watching the light reflect off the surface. Okay, I muttered. Very interesting. I leaned back, exhaling hard, the weight of it all pressing down on me like a ton of bricks. So, I said more to myself than to her. All these years, 18 of them, she was just passing time with me. Playing house. For a second, Sarah hesitated. I saw something flicker in her eyes, doubt, maybe, but then she shrugged again, casual as ever. Not a farce, she said. Just a stopgap. A stopgap. Like I was some placeholder in her fairy tale. I took another sip of my drink. Warmth spread through my chest, but it couldn't touch the cold settling in my bones. I set the glass down, fingers tapping against the side, trying to make sense of it all. So, I started again. If Kevin hadn't left, if he hadn't gone abroad for his studies, your mother would have married him instead. You would have been his daughter. Sarah smiled, actually smiled, soft and dreamy. Yeah, she said without hesitation, just like a fairy tale. I let out a bitter chuckle, shaking my head. Interesting, I said under my breath. Then another thought hit me, hard. If you knew, who else knew about Kevin? I asked, eyes narrowing. She barely had to think. Oh, Grandma Amanda knows. My eyes darkened. Amanda, your mother's mother? Sarah nodded, like it was no big deal. Yeah. I nodded too, the pieces finally clicking into place. Oh, so she knows. What about Grandpa James? Her husband? Sarah shrugged, completely unfazed. Well, he knows too. I clenched my jaw, fingers tightening around the glass for a moment before I forced them to relax. No use breaking it over something I couldn't change. And how long have you known about this? I asked. She leaned back against the couch, tugging a loose thread on her sweater like we were just killing time. About 8 months, I guess. 8 months. My wife. My daughter. My in-laws. They'd all known. And not one of them said a damn word. I nodded slowly, my mind racing faster than my heart could keep up. Very interesting, I said quietly. Then I stood up. Sarah glanced at me, curiosity flashing in her eyes. What are you going to do, Dad? I turned to her, a slow smile curling at my lips. Not warm, not kind, just something else. I'm going to give everyone exactly what they want. Her smile didn't waver. In fact, she looked almost proud. You've done good, Dad, she said, her voice carrying this eerie tone, like I'd passed some final test. You gave Mom everything she deserved. Now, if she wants to be with her true love, don't stop her. I tilted my head, watching her with quiet amusement. No hesitation, no guilt, no second thoughts, just blind faith that her mother had done the right thing. I smiled back, slow and deliberate. Yes, dear, don't worry, I said, my voice smooth, almost soothing. I have no intention of stopping your mother. I gave her everything she deserves. I paused, watching her closely, and I'll make sure she continues to get exactly that. In the future, something flickered in Sarah's eyes. Uncertainty? Maybe. But she stayed quiet. I stepped closer, reached out, and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. And as for you, my dear princess, I continued, voice soft, steady, but firm. You'll also get what you deserve. Her smile faltered, just for a second. I let the silence stretch between us, then pulled away. Without another word, I grabbed my coat and walked out the door, straight to my lawyer's office. By the time I got there, I already knew exactly what I wanted. The receptionist greeted me with the usual polite smile, but when I gave her my name, she perked up, quickly ushering me toward Carter's office. Didn't expect to see you today, Daniel, Carter said, leaning back in his chair. What brings you in? I sat down, folding my hands in my lap. I need a divorce, I said flatly, and I need it expedited. His eyebrows went up. I see, he said, straightening. Anything specific you want out of this? I leaned in, full control of my assets. She gets exactly what the law requires, nothing more. No alimony, no generosity, no loopholes she can use later. If she thinks she deserves better, she could go ask Kevin. Carter nodded, thoughtful. Custody? I smirked. I think it's best for Sarah to be with her. They deserve each other. He raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. All right, he said, jotting notes. I'll get the paperwork started. Push for a fast resolution. Given the situation, we should be able to move quickly. Good, I said, rising to my feet. Keep me updated. Next stop, the bank. I walked in calm and composed. The teller greeted me with the usual smile. "How can I help you today, sir?" "I'd like to withdraw everything from my joint account," I said, sliding my ID across the counter. She typed away, expression neutral, until she saw the balance. Her eyes flicked up to me, cautious. "All of it, sir. All of it," I confirmed, then smirked. "Actually, leave $4. She hesitated, then nodded. A few minutes later, she slid a thick envelope of cash across the counter. "Would you like this counted in front of you?" "No need," I said, tucking it into my coat. "Thanks." Next, my office. I parked in my usual spot, walked in like it was any other Monday, and headed straight to HR. "Hey, Daniel," the manager greeted me. "Everything all right?" "Yeah," I said with a smile. "Just need to update the beneficiaries of my pension program. Remove Emily." She blinked. "Oh, sure. We can process that right away." I signed the forms, thanked her, then moved on, called my insurance company. In minutes, Emily was wiped clean from every policy I had. And finally, I made the last call. My mother answered on the second ring. "Daniel, is everything okay?" I took a deep breath, exhaled slowly. "Mom," I said quietly, "I think you should hear this from me first." I laid it all out. Emily's betrayal, Sarah's reaction, the cold certainty in my daughter's voice that chilled me more than the infidelity itself. There was silence on the other end, just for a moment. Then my mother sighed. "Well," she said dryly, "seems the apple didn't fall far from the tree." I chuckled under my breath. "No, it didn't." Then I smiled, but it wasn't soft, it was sharp. "But I intend to keep that apple on the tree." She didn't say anything, but I could hear her exhale. Not disappointment, not concern. Just a mix of resignation and approval. She knew me, knew I wouldn't let this go easily. We talked for a few more minutes. Then I hung up. The next day, Emily was served. I knew exactly where she'd be. At her office, glowing in the aftermath of her little affair with Kevin. She expected this. She knew I wouldn't just sit back and take it. But knowing and experiencing are two very different things. At first, she was calm. Probably assumed it was the usual divorce paperwork. Split everything down the middle, maybe snag some alimony to keep her comfortable. She thought I'd be predictable. She thought wrong. As she flipped through those documents, her calm began to crack. Fingers trembling, eyes scanning each page like they might change if she stared hard enough. And then, there it was. Panic. The realization setting in like ice in her veins. She had nothing. The house. Not in my name. Legally untouchable. No claim. The furniture? Not hers. Alimony? Not a chance. Our incomes were practically identical. All she was getting was child support. And that for 1 more years until Sarah turned 18. She must have read through the documents over and over again, desperate for a loophole, a shred of leverage. There was nothing. I made damn sure of that. Not long after, my phone rang. I let it buzz twice before answering. Calm as ever. "Hello. This is not fair." Emily's voice was sharp, frantic. "I'm supposed to get half of everything. That's how this works, Daniel." I leaned back in my chair, a smile tugging at my lips. "Oh, yes," she snapped. "I was your wife. I deserve half." I exhaled slowly, savoring the moment. "And I'm supposed to get half of yours." Silence. I could feel her mind racing, gears grinding, the math refusing to math. I smiled wider. Better we settle it in court. The day of the hearing arrived. I walked into the courtroom beside my lawyer, David Carter, smug, confident, the human equivalent of a shark in a suit. He lived for moments like these. A few minutes later, Emily arrived with her lawyer, Sophie Williams. David gave her a quick glance and muttered, "I'm going to outmaneuver her in court." I turned to him, raising an eyebrow. "Ditto," I said without thinking. David gave me a sideways glance, then smirked. "I meant in court." The Glendon, as I said, we both knew that wasn't the whole truth. I almost laughed, but before I could, the judge entered. Conversation over. Sophie stood first, cool and professional. "Your Honor, my client's husband has refused to pay her any alimony or offer settlement. We are demanding half of all his assets, as is rightfully hers under marital law." The judge barely had time to respond before David stood up, adjusting his suit, ready to present his case. Your Honor, my client's wife has also refused to give him half of her assets and has declined any settlement. The judge frowned, glancing between both parties. What exactly are you saying? David took a casual step forward, his voice smooth. Well, Your Honor, they both make nearly identical salaries. So I find myself at a crossroads. Should I demand alimony for my client or offer it? The judge sighed, clearly unimpressed. If both parties make the same amount, then neither qualifies for alimony. Emily stiffened, fists clenched on the table. Before she could explode, Sophie jumped in, voice tight. Your Honor, my client would also like to bring to your attention that Daniel emptied their joint account, leaving only $4. David didn't flinch. If anything, he looked delighted. David stepped forward, smooth as ever. That, he said, gesturing toward the court documents, is exactly what my client's wife contributed to that account. Silence followed, heavy, awkward. The judge turned to Emily, eyebrows raised. Anything else? Sophie hesitated, clearly trying to regain her footing. Yes, Your Honor. There is also the matter of child custody. Before she could finish, David cut in, calm and unbothered. We have offered the other party full custody. My client waives visitation rights. We will continue to pay child support for another year, until the child turns 18. A sharp, audible gasp echoed through the courtroom. Sarah! Her voice cracked as she cried out. You can't leave me, Dad. I am your daughter. I didn't turn to look at her. My jaw tightened, fists clenched beneath the table. But I kept my gaze fixed ahead. I had made my choice. There was no turning back now. The judge, however, turned his attention to her, his expression softening. Would you like to say something? He asked gently. Please come forward. Sarah hesitated. Then slowly, she stepped up to the witness stand, looking smaller than I had ever seen her. Fragile, vulnerable. When she finally spoke, her voice wavered. I didn't know my father didn't love me. Before she could continue, David stood up, adjusting his suit with precise, deliberate ease. Your Honor, may I ask the young lady a few questions? Sophie immediately shot up. Objection. Your Honor, she's just a child. The judge silenced her with a raised hand. Let it be. Proceed, Mr. Carter. David nodded and approached Sarah, his tone surprisingly gentle. Young lady, do you love your father? Sarah sniffled, then nodded. Yes. David nodded too. Do you respect your father? She replied, yes. A pause. Then David's tone sharpened, but only slightly. Why are your parents divorcing? Sarah's lip trembled. Because my mother's ex came back from Europe, and now they want to be together. So she's leaving him. David tilted his head thoughtfully. So that means your mother either never loved your father, or she loved her ex more. Which is it? Sarah opened her mouth. No words came out. She glanced at the floor, at me, back to David. Silence. She shifted on the stand, uncomfortable, tear-streaked, eyes darting, looking for someone to rescue her. I didn't move. This moment, this exact moment, was what I'd been waiting for. David pressed on, cool and methodical. So, tell me, Sarah, were you upset that your father was losing his marriage? Sarah hesitated. Her eyes flicked toward me again, searching for something, a sign, a reaction. I gave her nothing. She turned back to David, her voice barely a whisper. No, I was happy for my mother. David's eyebrow arched. Happy for your mother? She nodded. Yes. David sighed through his nose, exaggerated and slow, rubbing his chin as if pondering some profound truth. I see. So, Sarah, you didn't care how your father felt? You were fine with the divorce. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. Yes, Mom was going to be with her true love. David let out a low whistle. True love. He paced a step, then fixed his gaze back on her. Cold, unflinching. So let me get this straight. You didn't care about your father's feelings. You told him not to fight for his marriage. You expected him to lose his wife, accept it, and move on, because your mother deserved to be happy. Sarah bit her lip, breathing uneven. Yes. David's eyes narrowed. He took a step closer, his voice dropping, each word precise, deliberate. Then tell me, Sarah, why should he care for you? The courtroom fell into a suffocating silence. No whispers now, no shifting glances, just the echo of David's words hanging heavy in the air. Sarah stared at him wide-eyed, breathless, like the weight of it all had crushed whatever protest she might have had. David didn't let up. He leaned in slightly, his voice ablaze. "Now, let me ask you one final question." He paused, stretching the silence until tension clung to every corner of the room. "This is something you told your father. Word for word." "Let me quote him," David said, turning to me briefly before locking eyes with Sarah again. "If Kevin had never left, your mother would have married him, and you would have been his daughter." His voice was calm, too calm, and the words hung in the courtroom like smoke. "That would have been the perfect scenario, right?" He continued, voice like steel wrapped in silk. He let the silence stretch, then delivered the blow. "Your reply was, yeah, just like a fairy tale romance." Sarah gasped, audibly inhaling as if she'd been struck. David took a step closer, voice steady. "Is that correct, Sarah?" She froze, caught between her past words and their crushing impact. There was no escape, no one to shield her. Just the truth. Finally, her voice broke through. "Yes." David nodded slightly, as if that was all he needed. But he wasn't done. "You wanted to be Kevin's daughter," he said, voice low but clear. "You wanted to leave behind the father who stayed up all night when you had a fever last year." Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, as if that would protect her. He didn't stop. The same father who never missed a recital, never missed a parent-teacher meeting, never missed a single game. The man who wore the same 2 shirts to work for 3 years so you could have those roller skates. David's voice shook slightly, not with anger but disbelief. "And now, that same man is giving you exactly what you want. He's letting you live your fairy tale with Kevin and your mother." The silence hit like a weight, pressing down on Sarah. Then, David delivered the final question, sharp as a dagger. "What is wrong with that?" Sarah broke. Her shoulders shook violently, sobs tearing from her throat. "I'm sorry, Dad," she choked out. "I wasn't thinking straight. Please don't abandon me." For the first time, my composure slipped. My throat tightened. My vision blurred. I wanted to run to her, to hold her, to tell her it was okay, that I'd never leave. But I couldn't. I had to stay firm. I clenched my jaw, forcing the storm inside to stay contained. The judge, watching all of this unfold, finally sighed. He turned to Sarah, his voice softer now. "That's enough, young lady. You can go sit down." Sarah wiped her tear-streaked face and walked back to her seat, still crying, quieter now, but broken. The judge shifted his attention to Sophie, his tone sharper now, tinged with impatience. "Ms. Williams, I believe Mr. Carter interrupted you earlier. You may continue." Sophie stood, smoothing her blazer, that familiar smugness returning. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, clearing her throat. "My client and her fiancé do not want custody of the child. They are getting married and do not wish for the child to be in their presence." A stunned silence filled the room. The judge's face turned a deep shade of red, eyes flashing toward Emily, who sat frozen, eyes down, avoiding everyone. Sarah's sobs became more intense and heartbreaking, breaking the silence. The judge rubbed his temples, exasperated, then turned to me. "Mr. Parker," he said, voice sharp with disbelief. "You don't want custody. Your wife doesn't want custody. What are you two doing? Your actions and behavior could harm this child's future." I took a slow breath, steadying myself, then stood. "Your Honor, my mother, Natalie Scott, will take custody. I've already spoken with her, and she's agreed to take full responsibility for Sarah." The judge stared at me, silent for a long beat. Then, with a nod, he brought his gavel down. "The child will go under the custody of Mrs. Natalie Scott," he declared. "Both parents will pay child support. No need for alimony or settlements. The divorce is granted." The gavel's sharp crack echoed. Final, absolute. I turned to David. He was grinning, eyes alight with mischief. "That," he whispered with a chuckle, "was the fastest divorce in the history of mankind." After court adjourned, I made my way to my mother. Sarah was already there, sitting beside her, head bowed, still crying. My mother rubbed slow circles on her back, soothing calm. I sat beside them. For a moment, I just watched Sarah cry, feeling the full weight of it all crash over me. Then quietly I spoke. "Sweetheart," I said, my voice calm but firm, "we don't live in a fairy tale. We live in the real world." Sarah lifted her head slightly, eyes red and swollen, searching mine. She sniffled but stayed silent. "I never wanted to abandon you," I continued. "But I needed you to understand what it feels like when the people you love turn their backs on you. Like you're just an old pair of sneakers, used, worn out, and thrown away." She flinched, tears welling up again. I could see the protest in her eyes, but she held it in. "We forget what people have done for us because we think it was their duty," I said, voice steady. "And because of that, we believe they don't deserve anything in return. Not love, not gratitude, not even respect." She wiped her nose on her sleeve, her lips trembling, still silent, still listening. "Love is a two-way street," I told her gently. "You give love, you get love. You give respect, you get respect. But if you give hate—" I paused, watching her hands twist together in her lap. "You get hate in return." "I've always cared about you, Sarah," I said, my voice softer. "But the way I was treated hurt, more than you can imagine." She turned her face away, ashamed. "If I let you walk all over me today, you'd walk over someone else tomorrow. And not everyone will just walk away. One day, you might hurt someone who won't take it. Someone who'll give it back, maybe worse." Her small frame trembled. Then, barely audible, she whispered, "No, that wouldn't be good." She looked up at me again, and for the first time I saw something new in her eyes. Sorrow, yes, but understanding too. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered, and then she threw herself into my arms. Her body shook as she sobbed against my chest, every ounce of regret pouring out. I held her close, letting her cry, letting her feel, until slowly she pulled away. Her face was tear-streaked, eyes swollen, but something had shifted, something softer, something real. She wiped her cheeks, hesitant. "What about Mom?" she asked, voice small. I sighed, a sad smile tugging at my lips. "I've been waiting for that question." Gently, I tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "She made her choice, Sarah, to abandon me, and to abandon you. She's moved on." Sarah's lip quivered, but she didn't look away. "There's no point chasing someone who doesn't want to stay," I said. "All we can do now is let fate decide. But we should be grateful for one thing." She frowned slightly, confused. "She never truly loved me, so she spared me from living a lie. And as painful as it is, she abandoned you too, spared you from false hope. What we have now, it's real. No lies, no betrayal, just the truth." Her eyes shimmered again, but this time the tears didn't fall. She leaned forward and hugged me tight, like she'd never let go. "Thanks, Dad," she whispered. 2 months passed, and life began to settle. Sarah smiled more, laughed more. She was healing. We both were. Our bond wasn't perfect, but it was strong, and it was enough. One sunny afternoon, Sarah burst through the front door, her face practically glowing. I was on the couch, reading the paper, when she rushed in. "You won't believe what I just heard," she blurted out. I set the paper down, raising an eyebrow. "What?" She grinned, breathless. "That Kevin guy, he treated my mother badly." For a second, I was stunned. Then I laughed, short, involuntary. I wasn't proud of it, but after everything, I couldn't help myself. Sarah's eyes widened. Then, realizing the absurdity, she chuckled too. "Did you expect that?" she asked, shaking her head. I smirked. I was married to your mother for many years, and hearing her complaints daily was hard to bear. I leaned back, arms crossed. I guess their fairy tale was written by the Brothers Grimm. Sarah laughed harder, but then her smile faded slightly. "So, how is she?" she asked. "In the hospital," she said. "And Kevin? He's in jail." I exhaled, nodding. "Figures." She tilted her head, watching me. "I have a feeling she'll be calling you soon." I was about to respond when Olivia walked in from the kitchen, drying her hands on a towel. She'd been making dinner, but now she glanced between us, curious. "Did I miss something?" she asked. Sarah turned, a soft smile on her face. "Nope," she said, looking at her, really looking. "You didn't miss anything, Mom." Dear listeners, What did you think of this story? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.